Alright guys, so I'm recording a note I'm posting this note before this first part of this episode. So I have broken this episode into two parts. My first recording is almost an hour long. I had a lot of speculation. I was wanting to talk about Christianity before the writings of the New Testament, and kind of the process of how the ideas got formed. So this first episode has a lot of questions, a lot of speculation, a lot of poor dates. I wasn't accurate with the dates because I was going by my memory, so I was kind of guessing. The second part is actually going to have more accurate dates. It's actually going to talk about the specifics of the 7 ecumenical councils. I don't know how to pronounce it, but the first 7 councils, the first one being the Council of Nicea, which is kind of around when, Christianity was starting to be, more solidified. So these councils have, they started in the 300s AD and went through the 700s. I believe there are 11 of them total, but the first 7 happened almost all the way up to the year 800. And so there's like a 500 plus year period where there's these councils going on in different countries in different parts of the world. And then before those councils there were 300 years or so since Jesus was on the earth. So there was a big gap between when those things were starting to be solidified by different churches, Orthodox, Catholic, different kind of churches. And my main interest is, how did Christianity look? So it kind of gives kind of my speculation on it from my own understanding in this first part. And then it goes more into kind of what the history says as far as the dates and the terminology and what was happening at the councils. I also had the accurate dates for, the books of the New Testament. I was incorrect. I spoke incorrectly saying that Mark was the first book. Mark was the first gospel, but Galatians was the first New Testament book written. Let me see. Let me just put the date in here because I want you guys to have some accurate information, and if in case you don't watch or listen to the next one. My notes are I write my notes on my phone. So let me see. So I'll just read this note. It's from havefunwithhistory.com. It says I wrote this, I think, this note, and then I put the link. Mark was the first gospel written near the years of 60 to 70 AD. The first New Testament book written was Galatians. All books were written between approximately 49 AD, which is when would have been technically maybe one of the earliest times that Galatians could have been written. There's a range. All of them have a range. So I didn't put the range for Galatians just the earliest part of that range would be 49 AD for Galatians, and the latest, which would be the end range, would be 95 AD for 3rd John. So you can kind of see it took about, let's say, if Jesus' death was about 33 AD, that's about 16 years, approximately 16 years at the earliest, before Galatians was even written. And so, there was a time when there was no New Testament texts anywhere. Let me see. Let me see if I can find who wrote Galatians. Turning these thin pages. Paul, an apostle. So the salutation assumes it was Paul. Now, I think that's all I'm gonna say. I just wanted to put this out there because I don't like putting inaccurate information. So I'm gonna let the rest of this episode still get recorded because I think there is value to it. But just know that a lot of the speculation of the dates I'm talking about, it was kind of guessing. And the next episode will have the notes with more dates, accurate dates for these, books of the Bible, of the New Testament, as well as these councils that started happening in the year 325 AD. So we'll go from there, and then I'll start explaining what was discussed in those councils and try my best to define some of the complex terminology. The reason why I think all this is important is just to show how the Christian church, kind of formed its ideas. You can see that there are all these ideas about the Trinity, about divinity of Jesus, that seems like maybe those ideas weren't fully there. They weren't like solidified. There was still question about them earlier on, like before the year 49 AD when Galatians was written. So yeah, just want to put that out there. And there's going to be a second part as well. I haven't recorded that yet. I've only written down the notes, and I have to go through my notes while I'm recording it because I do not have that committed to memory. And then we'll keep going. All right, guys. Hopefully this is helpful. And the reason why I'm cutting this into 2 parts is because it would be way too long. I try not to go too far over 1 hour. So, all right. With that, here comes this part 1, and then you'll have part 2. I'm going to post them both at the same exact time. So part 1 and part 2 will be available simultaneously. All right, theory and theology, what's up? Let's hope that this episode does not get cut off. It is raining. My Wi-Fi is not that good today, and so I'm on 5G. Let's try it out. That was working before, but lately my 5G has been not as good as usual. So I don't know. I'm just trying to save myself some steps of recording onto my phone and then uploading the file and all that kind of stuff. So I've got some intro that I'm gonna do right now, and then I'm gonna probably post once I finish the actual research. So this question keeps coming up online because now I think it's kind of connected to my algorithm situation because I've been studying a lot of history about the church. And so I mentioned, I was watching videos by, what's his name? Let's see if I can get the name. Gotta look through my history. Matt Whitman. I don't know where I got William from. So Matt Whitman, he goes to a lot of churches and, he meets with the priests or the clergy or whoever and talks to them. And so, it's kind of interesting. So I think it was the Orthodox Church that mentioned that they were the first church that came at Pentecost. Now, I want to talk about the council at Nicea, and sometimes when I'm, listening to stuff, and, sometimes I'm like half napping, like I turn on podcasts and other things while I'm like kind of napping, um, or just relaxing, and then it turns into a nap. And so sometimes I listen to stuff when I'm driving. Sometimes I'm actively listening or watching. Sometimes I'm just like, I'm just trying to chill. Let's see if I take a nap or what happens. And so I was listening to something yesterday evening, and it seemed like they mentioned that there were multiple councils, like one or two in the year like near like 312 AD or CE, and around, let's call it 330 something AD CE, and another one in like 600 or something. Like there were these councils, right? So I'm trying to get to the bottom of this. Maybe not the bottom of this, but kind of shed more light on or understand more how the church developed into what it is now. Because I explained, how my, you know, how I grew up in an Adventist church. I kind of explained how that church was, how they had like different rock churches, like a rock church or like more like drums, and it's kind of like, I wouldn't really call it entertainment because I think when people are doing it, they don't feel like it's entertainment. They feel like it's worship. I don't think I've ever gone to a church really and felt like it was entertainment, but I have heard people say that before. Like I remember going to like a black Adventist church with a lot of non-black friends, and they didn't really understand the culture, and people were like, it was like not a formal church service. It was like after the church service, they had like a young adult slash youth service, but there were adults there too, like older adults, because some of them like drove their own kids there or whatever. And people were clapping, and like, they're, this was the type of church where they were a little more enthusiastic, like clapping, the clapping and like the amen and like the, like those kind of shouting out kind of, expressions weren't like to show that like, oh, I'm being very entertained. It was more like this music is touching me when these youth are singing, these soulful songs, and people were getting really kind of like in the spirit about it, and so they would clap or like, or show, by their energy, the people who were listening to the people singing, kind of how how they were experiencing that music. It was kind of like if you've ever been in an environment where you're like in a church and it feels like really stale, really dull, really kind of like I had a friend that used to say that this, where it was like sometimes when you're in a church it feels like the spirit isn't there. It's just kind of like we're going through the motions. Nobody's really into it. Versus when you're at a church service or somewhere where you feel like really deeply touched by the service. There's just something that touches you, either the message or the singing or the chanting or whatever happens in that service. It might be very touching. And one of my friends, I was like, she looked like mad, she's like sitting next to me, just kind of like scowling, and I'm just like, kind of like, what's up, you know? She's like, oh well, you know, worship isn't supposed to be entertainment, and I was kind of like offended because I was kind of like, well, this is a cultural thing. Like they're expressing how they feel. They're not clapping heartily because they feel like it's like an R&B concert or something. Like that wasn't the case, but I could see how people could take it that way. But she was like offended, thinking like, oh, they're trying to like put on a show, and then everyone's feeling like, oh, I want you to entertain me, so they're like clapping, and it's like that wasn't. I could tell that wasn't what was going on, but she couldn't interpret it that way. Um, and you know, so there are churches that are more conservative, that are more traditional, very traditional. Like Orthodox and Catholic churches seem to look and maybe like I think it was called Episcopal. There are a lot of churches that seem to look pretty traditional compared to the churches that I described, explaining my experiences in LA in the Adventist church, how sometimes it was in like a gym, or sometimes it's like they have chairs instead of pews, or like, they might have like a drop down like screen or like PowerPoint for like a slide presentation, or maybe they'll show like a movie clip and things like that. Like some churches, some of those really ancient style churches, you would probably never see that. They might have microphones, um, or maybe if it's like a huge mega church type of place, they might have like extra monitors so you can like see from certain distances or angles, but they might not have all this like extra like updated instruments like electric guitars, drums, all that. Be showing like movie clips, even if it is about like Jesus or the Bible, or like somebody's testimony, or like some mission trip footage or something. Like they probably wouldn't be showing that in the service. It might be something they would take outside of the service and have like a separate kind of meeting and have it that way, not during the worship service. So okay, so saying all that, I think it was the Orthodox Church that said at Pentecost, which is described, I believe, in the book of Acts, where, the believers were worshiping, and while the believers were worshiping, like, I guess with Mary, tongues of fire came on their heads, like above their heads, and um, I need to brush up and actually read through this again, but like tongues of fire came onto their heads, and hundreds of people, I don't know if it was hundreds or thousands, I think hundreds, like 500 or 600 or something like that, were converted to become Christians. And they say that that's when that church was developed. Now, to my understanding, at that point in time, I need to know the years, so I'm going to need to go back and research this. But that's their explanation. This isn't like word for word what the Bible says. I need to go back in and like read what it says in the Bible. But I believe Pentecost and Shavuot are the same. Let me actually look that up real quick. Are Pentecost and Shavuot the same? Does it come from the same thing? So I'm gonna search that right now. Are Pentecost and Shavuot the same? So while Shavuot is sometimes referred to as Pentecost in Koine Greek, due to its timing after Passover, Pentecost meaning 50 in Greek, and Shavuot occurring 50 days after the first day of Pesach / Passover, it is not the same celebration as the Christian Pentecost, which comes 50 days after Pesach. So Pesach is what Israelis, at least currently Israelis, or maybe it was a historical thing, referred to as Easter. But the first of those days before Christians started celebrating Easter, and what is now Pentecost, when people still had the Jewish holidays that they were celebrating, and there weren't any of these other holidays that were trying to match any of these other Roman or Greek culture days. They were based on like the sun worship and things like that. I believe in the Bible times, in the first experiences of these would have technically been on the Jewish holy days, and then throughout time, after these councils, once the Roman leaders started getting involved, and Christianity became a religion of Rome, like their main religion. Rome is the one that started changing everything outside of Judaism, so that there's Easter. There was not Easter before. There was not, like, if you look in the Bible, you don't find Christmas, you don't find Easter, you don't find Halloween, you don't find Thanksgiving. None of those holidays are in the Bible. Even what we have as the new year, it's based on the sun. It's not based on the lunar calendar. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, is a different date than the New Year of what the Gregorian calendar is, which Christianity follows. Now, there are select groups of Christians that do follow, the Jewish traditions more. So Messianic Jewish congregations do kind of take the roots back to before Rome changed everything. So, as I understand it, their practice is more similar to what the early Christians would have been doing. Like, say, when Jesus died in the year, when he was crucified, and I believe one of those churches said, he was raised 40 days later. He raised from the dead. Even during that time period, people weren't celebrating Easter. There weren't really a lot of like non-Jews involved in Christianity. It was mostly Jewish people who believed in Jesus as, at the least, a rabbi. Some believed he was a prophet, a healer. Some believed he was the Messiah. Even the idea of Jesus being God, the divinity and the trinity and all these things, that was a little bit of a question that did come up in the writings of the New Testament. But mind you, these writings were published or made available like multiple decades after the death of Jesus. And so they weren't written like right at the year 33. Like, they were written like way later. And I really need to get a timeline together on this stuff, because I'm kind of bad at, once I hear something and then it goes past my memory, I kind of forget the years. But I'm trying to create a timeline of like when things changed in the church. Now, I'm not here to say what's right, what's wrong, but ever since my youth, I always had a question, like, because I would read the Bible and I picked up on this just naturally on my own. I was like, okay, like, yeah, they talk about Jesus and all that, but I would look and I would be like, oh, so, you would think, you know, Jesus lived to be, let's say 33 or so, right? Like, he lived a pretty long length of time. So what would stop people from, you would think within his 33 or so years on earth, you would have seen a Christmas celebration or a celebration of his birth or something, even while he was living, right? I was like, well, why don't they ever celebrate Christmas? You see Jesus celebrating Hanukkah or the Festival of Lights, um, but you don't see Christmas celebrations. And I need to charge my mic. I'm gonna save this for now. I'm gonna charge my mic. All right, I'm back. So yeah, since I was younger, I was like, okay, that's kind of odd that Jesus had his birth, the virgin birth. You see the birth story happen, and it seems like a big deal. At least some of the accounts show that there were the Magi who came after his birth but were following the star looking for him. King Herod heard about him or the birth, and started killing all the babies around his age range because he was paranoid about this potential king coming into power and taking him over, taking his place, killing him, whatever was going to happen as the king of the Jews, because the Jews were being ruled over at that time by Herod. He, or I don't know if it was his wife or his daughter or whoever it was that had a role in killing John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus. Jesus kind of disappears a little bit until, like, you see him at the temple when he's about age 12 or so, which, he's probably considered culturally maybe a man by that point, or maybe he was in the process of becoming bar mitzvah. I don't really know. That's kind of how I read into it usually, that's why he was in the temple, with these other, like, scholars, and showing that he was learned, and people valued his teachings, and he seems like he's accepted as a legitimate rabbi. When he starts his ministry, he gets baptized, he starts his ministry, he calls disciples, a lot of fishermen and things like that. He doesn't go looking around the temple, for other, maybe people who would have already been shining students in the temple, already approved to, like, study under rabbis and had, like, a good reputation. He chose the people that, according to Velvet Elvis by Rob Bell, yeah, he was, those people who were working with their fathers or working in some kind of trade didn't really cut it. Their family either needed them to work to make money, or they didn't shine in the eyes of the other rabbis who would take them on, in the tradition to become a Talmud, a student of a rabbi. He went and he called his own students, and he had disciples. This was a common practice. Rabbis had students, and that's how you would learn. And then you could become a rabbi or whatever, you'd have some kind of standing. But he had 12 disciples. I believe Judas wasn't called, but Judas came along. There seems to be other people that were around him too, some women that were around him too. But he had a place in the community, it sounds like, for a few years in his 30s, where he was seen at a wedding, where he did his first miracle of turning the water into wine. Like, you see him, at least for, like, it seems like approximately a 3-year period, as well as maybe when he's about 12 years old. You never hear about, oh, it was the birthday of Jesus, So there's this kind of mixed storyline, because I know at that time period, maybe in the culture, only kings really celebrated their birthdays, from what I've been taught. It wasn't like everybody would just be, like, celebrating their birthday all the time. It was something that, like, kings and royalty did. They celebrated their birthdays. But, like, the annual, like, your first birthday, your second birthday, like that. But it seems like they kept track to some extent, because eventually you'd become bar mitzvah. And so I don't know where that tradition came from or where it started, but it seems like somebody was keeping track of that year. So age did have some kind of significance to it, but I guess maybe culturally people weren't celebrating birthdays the way that we do in Western culture today. But it also was I was also kind of like, okay, well, if people did consider that he was the king of the Jews, or going to be the king of the Jews, or the Messiah or something, wouldn't they have, like, tried to celebrate his birthday or something, Like, I don't know, it just never really added up for me. And then Easter, of course, that came after the fact. There was no Easter. There was another holiday that was like a Roman pagan holiday that is Easter, basically. And now that same day is the day that, Christians no longer follow that holy day that was in the Bible time. There's that, I guess, confusing date where they say in the Jewish month of Nisan, one account states that Jesus had a Passover Seder the night of Passover evening, and then the next day was crucified. Another account states that he had a dinner that wasn't a Passover Seder, and the next day was crucified. And I think those dates are Nisan 14 versus Nisan 15. And so the early church, it seems like they were split in the commemorative years of remembrance of, the crucifixion of Jesus. They would either celebrate on Passover or the day before Passover. Because the way the Jewish days go are, there's evening and there's morning. According to, the creation story, there was evening and morning. That was the first day. So that's why even the Sabbath starts Friday evening, when the sun goes down on Friday. That's the start of day 7. Day 7 ends when the sun goes down on Saturday night. That's the end of day 7. And technically that starts day 1. Saturday night is day 1 versus people who follow, the 7-day calendar, where Sunday is the first day of the week, but starts with, midnight on Sunday morning. And so right now I'm recording this on Sunday. It's technically 4:49 p.m. I'm probably going to post this on Monday or Tuesday. It's 4:50 now, 4:50 p.m. Sun sets around 5:30, 5:25, something like that. So technically, the first day in the Jewish days, since Saturday night is when day one started, when the sun sets tonight, that technically starts day 2 of the week, which is Monday, versus, in Los Angeles, we consider midnight to be, Sunday. Once it's midnight, it's now Monday morning. So yeah. And so, let me see. So I've only got a couple notes, but I'm going to finish my notes and then I'll finish the rest of this post. But this is just my intro to kind of what I'm trying to talk about here. So, I talk about Henry Abramson a lot. He talks in some videos about Christianity, how it was originally a sect within Judaism, because the early Christians were Jewish. The early Christians, like the very early Christians, while Jesus was on earth, were majority Jewish. And they were born Jewish. They came from Judaism. They were worshiping with other Jews. They had a rabbi named Jesus, or a rabbi in their community who was accepted named Jesus, and some of them were his disciples. And they followed his midrash. They followed him, his teachings. Now that's why you always see the Pharisees and the scribes and all these other leaders kind of like challenging him, because they're like, you're not doing things the way that we do it. All these other people who were leaders, and rabbis and teachers, they would have had students too, but they would have all kind of been teaching in line with a certain method. And he was kind of on his own path of teaching that seemed to be rubbing them the wrong way. So, I guess my main interest is, in Christianity before Rome got involved. Because at the time when Jesus was alive, Rome ruled, but, Rome hadn't adopted Christianity as a religion. It wasn't really that widespread yet. It was still technically Judaism. I don't really think people were called Christians yet. I think they were still considered Jews, and Jesus was a rabbi, and they were following him. Those who chose to follow him were following him. And there was a lot of preaching that happened after the death of Jesus, where, per history, there was almost like, a few hundred years during which different letters were being written, and, the New Testament was being formed. Like, those letters were being written, like, the Gospels, and, because when you think of it, when Jesus was on earth, there were no Gospels. The New Testament wasn't even there yet. It wasn't even written until ages after his death. So people weren't following the New Testament. All the stuff that we read, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, all those letters, Revelation, all that stuff happened in history, was written after the death of Jesus. And a lot of it was influenced by by the council at Nicea. A lot of those writings were influenced by the council at Nicea, I believe. I need to double check on that, because I need to get my date straight about the timeline. I believe Mark I may have talked about this before. Excuse me. I don't recall if Mark is the first gospel written or the first New Testament Bible book written. Chronologically, in the written New Testament, Matthew is put as the first one, but Mark was actually written before Matthew, Luke, and John. It was written before all of those. And that's why they say in the book of Mark, you don't even see. I'm gonna have to go back and check this, but something I was listening to said in the book of Mark, you don't see this virgin birth, this divinity of Jesus. He was born just as a human. You don't see Joseph, the father of Jesus, in there as a role, because it was written early. And I guess there's potential that when the book of Mark was written, these ideas about Jesus having a virgin birth and being a divine child, and the angels either coming to Joseph, or in the other account where the angel shows up to Mary, these accounts didn't exist yet. These are different accounts. Like, Mark doesn't show those accounts, apparently. Now, this is what somebody said that I was following there. I was reading what they wrote. Now, is that accurate? I do not know. I need to go back and check. So this is stuff that I'm going to put in my notes to check on. But that's what I'm going to be reading up on, and that's what I'm going to record on next. I'm going to attach it to this episode, because these are things I want to know. So basically, I'm going to have to write this stuff down. So we're going to look at the chronological. Where am I going to write this? All right, we're going to look at this chronological order of Bible texts, the chronicle of New Testament Bible texts, and then we're going to look at Mark, about the divinity and virgin birth, about Joseph. I don't have a Bible in front of me while I'm talking right now. About Joseph, about angels coming, and so I want to see when these books were written, compared to the Council at Nicea. I'm writing. So when these books were written, because I think that's important, because at the Council of at Nicea, that's when a lot of the, Rome wasn't wanting to take on the Christian religion as an official religion of the kingdom of Rome, because it was, they didn't have Easter solidified yet. There were people celebrating at Nisan 14, people celebrating Nisan 15. It seems like there was a big battle between these groups. There were people who talked about the virgin birth. I don't know. Maybe they didn't talk about it yet. I need to look at the timeline. About Jesus being the Messiah, that was another topic. About the Trinity, that's another topic. There are all these topics. And yeah, so these ideas, while Jesus was on earth, some scholars say that these ideas weren't there. Others say that maybe they were. There is also this idea that there are potentially other letters and, what would you call it? Letters or books that are not, like letters or, books that, weren't found, or maybe they got destroyed or lost or something. But I do think it's very important that there's this timeline where there is no New Testament yet. There's this timeline where, Christians are basically Jews at a certain point. They're not modern day Christians. They're not worshiping on Sundays. They're not going to church on Sundays yet. That doesn't exist. They're still celebrating Jewish holy days. They're still, before they get excommunicated from the Jewish synagogues, they're still worshiping in synagogues with other Jews. This is even after the death of Jesus. Early Christians were still Jewish. But over time, all this changes once, more Gentile, non-Jewish people start joining the religion. There's a timeline of, different, I guess the history comes more from, the Catholic Church explains the history more. But, during the years after Jesus, different disciples, different followers of Jesus are going out to different places, Asia and Turkey and Ethiopia, and they eventually get over to Rome. But before that, they're around like in Jerusalem and all these other countries, all these other major cities, and a lot of them get killed, trying to spread the word of God, in these other places. And a lot of this is before a lot of the New Testament was even written. They were still technically Jewish people going to places and I think spreading the message to Hindus, in India. They're traveling all over the place and getting killed all over the place. And John writes the book of Revelation at a certain point when he gets, exiled to the island. He has a vision and writes the book of Revelation. Then, while these people were still living, they're still writing, so after Jesus, it took that long, for a lot of these books to be written. And if you think about it, I don't really know the ages of the disciples. People in the movies and stuff, they always seem like they're like old men, like old white men. According to Rob Bell's book, they must have been around maybe the age of 14 or something. Because when you think of it, people's lifespans weren't that long, and they were working with their fathers. So let's say their fathers even lived to be 60. These men were younger than 60, because Jesus was like in his early 30s. Let's say Jesus was about 30. So he was choosing people that still had fathers alive. So let's say that they were probably 40 years old or younger. It doesn't say that any of them were really married or anything. Most of them didn't seem like they were married. So they were probably pretty young. I don't know for sure. I'm just saying, I don't remember hearing about the disciples being married. And it seems like quite a few of them, some of them did have their own trade. Like Matthew was a tax collector and things like that. Like he was already working, but there were some other guys who weren't, they were working with their family, in their family trade. So they outlived Jesus, and they have these multiple decades where they're preaching in other countries, other areas outside of Israel, and they're getting killed in the process. They're writing books of the Bible in the process. Like, Paul didn't even come on the scene for quite a while, and so Paul wrote a lot of books of the New Testament, and so that's kind of what I want to explain, because I feel like it's not clear. When we look at the Bible, it's easy to see all the kind of modern day stuff, and I'm not saying it's wrong. Like, at a certain point, it's like, whatever. At a certain point, you're still worshiping God, and if that's the whole point, whatever way the religion says to do it, whether you're going through Mary or going through the saints or going through Jesus or believing in the Trinity or whatever, it's like, well, I think the thing that all these religions have in common, including Islam and Judaism, is that they're worshiping God. There is kind of like that, concern that Jews and Muslims have that, some forms of Christianity, according to them, use forms of idolatry or worship other gods. Some people would say that worshiping the Trinity is almost like worshiping three gods. Someone did mention that, Judaism being monotheistic, it was rare. There weren't like really monotheistic religions like that around. Maybe there were some that I don't really know about. I'm not like too read up on history, but I can only think of Judaism as the only one that I've ever known about that has just the one God. Even Rome at that time, Greece at that time, they had all these gods. And so it's possible that, the Trinity is more easy to digest for some of these other non-Jewish groups, because at least they don't have to get rid of having all these other aspects of gods or God. At least they get one that has three, and that's a whole conversation for a whole other time. That's one of those topics I don't think I'll ever be able to kind of really get to too easily. I don't mind talking about it. It's just, it's very complex. Because at the end of the day, a lot of stuff is based on faith. It doesn't matter what the books actually say. People are going to believe what they're going to believe, which is why I'm not here to say, like, believe what I say or believe my interpretation or whatever. Like, I don't even know if my interpretations are right. They change based on what I learn. So it depends what I'm studying. I would say that certain things I do believe, certain things I don't believe. And like, even for example, there's not historical proof of the Exodus. Jewish scholars and historians even mention that. And so it's like, there's stuff like that where it's like, okay, there's this whole, the story of Exodus and like the Jews leaving from slavery, from Pharaoh and all this kind of stuff. And, if that many Jews left, like, why is there no proof of pottery or anything that, like, what, did they just leave and not take anything with them at all? All those people took nothing with them and then went wandering for 40 years, in the desert. There's nothing in the desert. There's nothing in the Dead Sea or the sea that, they think they found like chariot wheels or something. I don't really know. But there's things like that where it's like a lot of us would say, yeah, I believe, you either believe in the Bible that, the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt, and then they eventually, Moses led them out into the desert, eventually into the promised land, where Moses didn't get to go. He saw it, I guess, from a distance, but died, and didn't get to go in. And I think he was like 120 years old when he died or something. He spent that last 40 years of his life wandering the desert, but he started out, being raised in, Pharaoh's kingdom in Egypt. He was raised in Egypt as an Egyptian prince, basically. It's like, that's, when you think of it, it's like, okay, he's a Hebrew of origin, raised in Egypt, which is Africa. It's like, when you think of these stories, it's like, what is going on? And then, people would say, a lot of people, even though there might not be proof of it in archaeological, like, digs and things, there's no conclusive proof that many people left Egypt from slavery as being Hebrews and wandering in the desert. Now maybe the proof got covered up because, history, Egypt is a big nation. I mean, the Jews had the biblical writings on their side of the stories and the oral stories that eventually got written down. But, Egyptians, some of them were literate as well. And they had a writing system as well. And is it in their history that there were slaves and Hebrews that left? Like, but what I'm saying is that, there's a lot of stories like this where it's like, even if there's no proof of it, even in archaeology, most of us would say, if you believe in the Bible, most people who believe in the Bible wouldn't really refute that the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians and left with Pharaoh, chasing after them, Pharaoh's chariots chasing after them and stuff. And then the chariots got drowned, and did Moses open the water and things like that for the Israelites to come through. And then once they got to the other side, the chariots got drowned. Most people wouldn't, put up too much of a fight about that. When it comes to the Trinity, that's very much a big part of Christian doctrine. Most churches believe in the Trinity. I would say Jehovah's Witnesses don't. There are select groups that maybe question it, but I'd say most, probably 98% of Christian groups believe in the Trinity. I know there are a lot of individual Christian people who kind of question it, but I don't really know that many actual denominations that outwardly say, like, we don't take on the Trinity as, part of our beliefs. I think the Jehovah's Witness church is the only church I've ever heard outwardly saying that. But also there aren't a lot of there's some churches that I've never, heard from. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses, they've knocked at my door, and I've studied with them for a little bit. And so that's how I know, because I heard them say it, and I had one of their free Bibles that they gave me that had their version of the Bible. They took out, it doesn't have John 1:1 like as the other Bibles do. They say that theirs is a translation, not a version. they taught me, and I don't know how accurate this is, that a translation is, taken from the original scrolls or texts versus a version which is translated from an actual translation of the original text. So they state that they have a translation and that theirs is more accurate. John 1:1 that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, or whichever order that goes in. Their Bible literally doesn't have in it the Word was God. They don't have that in there. Now, I don't know. I don't have original versions of the New Testament. I actually have one, but I can't really read Greek yet. I can read Hebrew enough to kind of get by a little bit with a dictionary. But my friend gave me this New Testament that's in Greek. It's called, and it has a dictionary. It's called the Greek New Testament, 4th Revised Edition. I don't know what version of the Bible this is. I've barely ever looked at it. United Bible Societies, Dutch Bibelgesellschaft. I don't even know. I've never seen that word. It says in cooperation with the Institute for New Testament Textual Research, Munster/Westphalia. It's got a table of contents. It's just called the Greek New Testament. I don't know. I guess that's all it's called. I don't know if it's even like a version. Early version. So it has a lot of historical information that's in English. And it has the books of the Bible. The New Testament Bible. So if I even try and find the book of John, so I know that says Matthew, Mark, Lucas, I don't know what that means, but I guess page 312. So it would have been the first sentence on page 312. I'm just going to look it up to see if I can even see what it says at all. I can't even read Greek, guys, so don't listen to me. Okay, yeah, it looks like it says kata yoan. So kata, and then I omega a n n h n. It says in English the Word became flesh, and then it says it has a few words and a comma, a few words and a comma, and a few words and a comma. So it does have those 3 sections. Now I don't know if it says in the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. I don't know if that's what it says, but there are 3 sections to that one sentence. That's kind of what I wanted to see, is if this Greek has it. But I don't know what the Jehovah's Witnesses were translating from, where they don't have it in theirs. So I don't even know what to say. But yeah. So these are my thoughts before I've done all the chronological research. All right. I'll get back into it But these are like early thoughts. I don't want to post this whole episode in case it takes me like a couple days, or in case I have to go back and re-record it if I got a whole bunch of stuff wrong. Because I'm kind of like going by the seat of my pants with just kind of, I'm trying to remember things without having to write them down, but it's really hard for me. Like, I've only started getting back into the Bible like a little bit more during this year, maybe the end of last year. I started getting back into studying Hebrew just because I enjoy it so much. But yeah, so I do want to get back into this stuff, but alright. Well, I'll be back with more.